And we are back on Consumer Choice Radio. I have the pleasure of introducing one of our guests for this week's program. He is a recurring guest now on Consumer Choice Radio. Thank you very much for joining us, Steve Forbes.
Good to be with you. Thank you.
Great. So, I mean, we're on the cusp of a 1.9 trillion with a T trillion dollar COVID relief bill, and we couldn't think of someone better to talk to than yourself about the good, the bad, and the ugly in this bill. So, what do you see? What's good? What's bad? What's ugly in Biden's kind of core piece of legislation so early on in his administration?
Well, despite the name of the bill, it's mostly a political payoff to the Speaker of our House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, and key constituency in the Democratic Party. Only very generously looking at that 1.9 trillion U.S., only about, you take a very generous look at the bill, only about 600 billion really relates to the COVID relief, including checks to individuals of an additional $1,400 to the 600 that went out a few weeks ago. The rest of it is political pork and payoffs. There are over $350 billion to various states and cities. That's a disguised bailout for mismanaged states. They jiggered the formula in this bill to favor blue states, as we call them, Democrat states that have been mismanaged, such as New York, California, Illinois, New Jersey, and others, while the so-called red states get punished, who've managed their finances well. There's a huge payoff of over $86 billion to various union-run pension funds that have been grossly mismanaged and not funded properly. So when you look at the pieces of it, it is really an abomination. If they just wanted to focus on COVID relief, they could do it for a fraction of that price, especially as the U.S. economy continues to show great resilience and strength. Moreover, we've got the third vaccine from Johnson & Johnson now out there, which means by the latest June that we will have what they call herd immunity. And literally hundreds of millions of doses are now going to be produced. So the coronavirus crisis is receding, and the U.S. economy, you look at various measures, whether it's manufacturing, retail sales, and the like, is ready to roar. But unfortunately, the Biden administration is putting obstacles in the way, including this mammoth bill. And one way they're going to finance this bill is by printing of money, and that's going to create problems down the road.
Definitely. Steve, this is Yael here. A question that I had is, in the alternate reality of a President Forbes, you talked about how this is not really going to help individual people. What would have been an alternative relief bill that would not have included all of these payoffs? Would that have been sort of just in direct payments again, or perhaps not at all? Or what would a better recovery plan or relief bill have looked like here in the first term?
Well, the recovery would have focused on first businesses that were hurt, especially small businesses, by the shutdown from the pandemic. And there's some money in there for that, but what the program called the payroll relief, what they call PPP, payroll relief, is getting only $7 billion. They haven't loosened restrictions on small businesses qualifying for these grants and loans. So in those particulars, in terms of helping small business, they could have done better. Wouldn't have cost much more, and they could have swept away a lot of the, what I think were stupidly conceived regulatory bureaucratic obstacles put in by our Treasury Department. That would have been good. Getting money out to help more vaccine distribution, that's fine. If you wanted to do another payoff to people, that would have been fine, even though I'm a conservative and most conservatives oppose it. I was in favor of those individual checks because they're one time, they don't distort the labor market, and they give people immediate relief. But the provisions they have in for topping up unemployment benefits will give millions of people pay them more not to work. We already have over 6 million job vacancies in the U.S., and they're rising as this economy recovers. So it would have been a much more focused approach, helping individuals directly, helping businesses. And I also would have gone for suspending the payroll tax in the U.S., which is about 15%, which hits people from the first dollar they earn. The U.S. income tax doesn't really hit the most lower income people. They get hit by state income taxes, but not by the federal. But something that was done on a smaller scale back under Barack Obama, President Obama, back in 2011, 2012, they had a small suspension of the payroll tax. I'd have done one 6 months or 12 months. That would have given both individuals, especially lower income individuals, a big pay increase, and also would have lowered the cost of hiring people by businesses. So it would have been win-win. So, and I would have cut out all this other pork that the junk they put in there. So it would have done a lot of good, had a lot of positive incentives, and would have cost a fraction of what they're doing now. And the key thing to keep in mind is that to finance this, they're not going to just finance it by floating more bonds. They're going to have the bonds be bought indirectly by the Federal Reserve, which means creating more money. And if you look at the U.S. banking system today, they are overloaded by a factor of several times of necessary reserves. So this money printing is going to be the old kind. I think it's going to have a danger of inflation later this year and early next year, and that's going to create unnecessary problems for the economy. Our central bank does not know how to deal with this, I don't think. But it was all unnecessarily self-created.
On that note of inflation, because that's something that Yael and I have spoken about previously. Our last episode touched on this. How resilient do you think the U.S. economy can be to these inflationary pressures? Because I know that there are some in that world who say it's not a problem, inflation is not coming. There are others who are maybe very loudly ringing alarm bells, saying that this kind of house of cards can only stand for so long. I'd love to hear your take on what that inflation could look like. I know you mentioned the latter half of this year, but walk our listeners through what this could look like if inflation does start to creep up on us.
Well, what it does mean is that consumer prices start to rise. And we haven't had a real binge of that since the 1970s, early 1980s, when it was finally conquered in the U.S. and in most of the rest of the world. And it's very distortive of the economy, especially hurts small businesses and job creation. And so it does real harm. And one of the big mistakes is that those who say, printing money doesn't matter anymore, ignoring places like Venezuela, they say it doesn't matter because look what happened after the 2008-2009 crisis. The Federal Reserve did a lot of creation, bought a lot of bonds, what they call quantitative easing. But what gets overlooked is that the banks at the time had to rebuild their balance sheets. They had to rebuild their reserves. And then you had what they call Basel III, which is an international agreement on capitalization for banks. Nobody knows about it. It's one of those obscure things that's out there, but has real consequences. And the Basel III, as they call it, Switzerland, where they did this agreement, those reserve requirements were met months ago by U.S. banks. So U.S. banks are chock full of reserves, unlike with the situation of 12 years ago where they had to rebuild balance sheets. So the money that the Fed creates now is more likely to get shot into the economy, whereas what they call quantitative easing, the huge amount of money creation the Fed did after 2008, in effect went into the deep freeze. Banks parked the money at the Fed, got a little bit of interest on the excess reserves, but we don't have that situation today in the sense that the banks don't have to rebuild their balance sheets. So if the Fed doesn't know what it's doing in terms of sterilizing this massive money creation from these bills that are being passed, and remember, the last bill that was passed in December and previous bills passed last year, COVID relief bills, there's over $1 trillion still unspent. So you've got this new near $2 trillion legislation going through, You have $1 trillion that still is unspent, which means that this money is going to be flowing in the economy not just this year, but hundreds of billions are going to be flowing into the economy next year at a time when the pandemic is, for all intents and purposes, over.
Now, Steve, last question before we go to break here on Consumer Choice Radio. We've had over the last 2 months a huge emphasis on financial markets and individual investors, retail investors, this entire revolution with Robinhood and democratization of finance and investing. What are your thoughts on this? Is this something that is interesting? Does it pose a threat to many of the main people on Wall Street? Is this something that we can look forward to in the future, or do you think this is a temporary fad?
Individuals getting involved in the market, no. Especially the big difference between this and other episodes in the past is that we have zero commissions. You don't pay commissions anymore on stock trades, which is phenomenal. And so it's costless to go in and out, in and out, in and out. And what you saw with GameStop and others is we've seen this movie in variations before. People get there gets to be a mania. They pile in. In this case, they smash the big short institutional short sellers, which everyone applauded because nobody likes short sellers, even though short selling has a real and necessary place in the financial and economic universe. Everyone hates them, just like everyone hates hyenas or sharks and things like that. They do have their place in the scheme of things, and so we've already seen GameStop have a huge rise and then huge falls. So a lot of people are going to get hurt, and you have to learn what rises rapidly doesn't necessarily stay up. It goes up and down, and not all stocks rise up. Some of them do, but a lot of them don't. And remember 20 years ago, Amazon, you had the high-tech bubble in the U.S., which crashed spectacularly. A lot of individuals got hurt. A lot of institutions got hurt. Most of those high-tech stocks went bankrupt, but the few that survived did very well. Amazon had a stock then, was $100 a share, went down when the crash came, went down to under $10 a share. Today, it's over $3,000 a share. So there'll be some survivors, but a lot won't survive, and individual investors and institutional investors always have to learn the lesson. Human emotions can get carried away. You can say it again and again, but it always happens. It's human nature. So this generation of investors, they'll be in the market, but a lot of them are going to learn it's a dangerous place if you're not careful.
And one quick follow-up on that, because I know there was a congresswoman who proposed adding additional taxes on trading so that there is a commission. Would that be appropriate policy, or would that just hurt lower income or retail investors?
It would hurt, and the politicians are always looking for ways to pick your pockets. And so if they put on a transaction tax, they all get mesmerized. Oh, we can get hundreds of billions of dollars in from this. They don't realize in this high-tech age, those trades can be executed offshore very easily, electronically. In New York State, they are talking about a transaction tax, and both the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ made quite clear if they do that in the state of New York, they can easily move their operations to Austin, Texas, or Dallas, Texas. And Texas has already been talking to them, hey, we'll welcome you with open arms. So stop taxing people, reduce the tax burden on people, and by golly, government will get the revenues, because when the economy prospers, government always gets its cut.
Well, thank you very much, Steve, for joining us again. It's been about a year since we last had you on, and I hope that if we do have you on in 1 year's time, we are no longer talking about COVID-19 and relief bills and all of this crazy spending. I have a feeling like when we do chat with you down the road, we'll probably still be talking about those things, but it's always a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you for your insight.
Really good fun being with you, and I hope the Biden administration learns sooner rather than later that sometimes less is more. If they did nothing except open up the economy, get kids back in school, economy alone, they'd look like geniuses in 6 months, because things would be really booming.
Perfectly said. Thank you, Steve. Very much appreciated.
Thank you. Take care.